Chag Sameach, everybody. Welcome, Rachel. Great to have Rachel Fish with us tonight. And I am so happy that you are with us, Rachel. Rachel, for those who do not know, is the founding director, executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. And that's just one of the things that are on her is on her CV that is very, very extensive. I'm going to spare a lot of introductions other than to say that I go way back with Rachel to the time when she was in the divinity school at Harvard and standing up for Israel and our interests in a very, very profound and courageous way that distinguished her back then, and it continues to set her apart from so many in our community as a courageous leader, somebody with clarity, with vision, and the wherewithal to do some really important work. And we're grateful that you're sitting in the role that you are now sitting in, and we're particularly grateful that you're joining us tonight to talk about emotional literacy. So welcome, Rachel Fish.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Hamilton. It's really a pleasure to be here. Chag Shavuot Sameach.
Same to you. I know that you know our broader theme is COVID demands meet Sinai Commands, and you and I have had some very interesting conversations lately about emotional literacy. That's a term you used, and I like it very, very much. And in terms of the Ten Commandments, this relates very specifically to the 10th of the Ten Commandments, which prohibits coveting, an emotion, if you will. So in many, many ways, I want to take the time between now and 11:30 to talk with you, to have a conversation first, and then we can open up to others who may want to join with questions about the whole notion of emotional preparedness. The needs are growing, they're deepening, they're widening. I wrote my Itavar today about self-harm and the ways in which that truly has been a pandemic in our country for the last 4 years, even prior to COVID-19's harmful arrival, taking so many lives, causing so much loss. We know that life expectancy in this country, even though people are living longer for the last 4 years successively, has actually been declining because of despair-related death. And one shudders to think about what is going to come out of this time where we are so disconnected, so detached. Plagues are different than destruction. That's why in the tradition, when we ask for divine protection, we say that we know how to respond to catastrophes, natural disasters, because we come together. With a plague, you can't come together. So the liturgy even makes a distinction between the disaster that brings us together, that allows us to survive it, and the contagion that actually prevents us from coming together. So all that makes the emotional toll much higher. The question I want to begin with is, does our society's approach to raising kids, our schooling, camping, vocational training, all the things that we tend to consider as givens in terms of what it means to raise a healthy, fulfilled, reasonably successful participant in our society, do those things prepare us at all for the emotional demands on our lives?
Obviously, these are very big questions. And I will not purport to be an expert on emotional well-being. I'm not a psychiatrist, a psychologist. I do not have training in this background. But I do feel as if it's something I'm deeply engaged with. And I do think that in the 21st century, many of our educational settings, formal and informal, are more cognizant of the need to have social emotional literacy and to have educators and facilitators who are skilled with these backgrounds. However, I don't think that my generation grew up with that language in any shape or form, or in most earlier generations, prior generations. We didn't have classroom discussions about how we felt. And there were not zones, red for being very angry to identify your frustration because your classmate won't share the toy. And now that is a language that is in play in our classes and and in our educational forums. However, I'm not sure all of us as parents are prepared to navigate that conversation, because when we ask our kids, how are you doing this morning? While we're also juggling rushing to work and juggling packing lunches and signing the permission slip and making sure the kid has the final, paper they needed to get out the door, I'm not sure we're all prepared for the actual answer. Because if we were prepared for the answer, then I think it would demand of us as the adults, as the caregivers, to model for our children that we would need to pause and to reflect and allow time for the actual answer to be heard and to settle in and have engagement with it. And I definitely don't think in a professional capacity, maybe you, Rabbi Hamilton, because in being a leader in a spiritual setting, and other clergy members, but the majority of us, I think, feel like we have to shelve that part of our identity when we walk into the workforce most of the time, because that's not what is expected of us or allowed in some way.
Yeah, like that kind of being able to make space for people's emotional well-being. I think that, by the way, one of the most acute emotions, we've talked about this a little bit, is the emotion of fear. And I want to move a little bit to that now, because that, I've argued, has bearing on your day job. That is the way in which hostility, conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, all kinds of people who look for targets to blame for their plight. The emotion of fear is a tremendously overriding kind of emotion. It cuts to the core of survival. It's existential. It's gets to the most raw and real threats to our safety. And when fear is operationalized, it very, or weaponized, I suppose I could say, it has the capacity to become extremely lethal. We know that historically. Our people knows that. I talked to somebody who did a shiur last week in Jerusalem, and it was called uh, two different viruses. It was the virus of COVID-19, and the other virus was anti-Semitism. And it was literally taking a hard look at, obviously, the current physical threat and the immense loss of life and the lethal nature, which we heard a little bit about in the last session from Alan Garber and his expertise in public health, and the nature of the way this disease can be exceedingly lethal when it has a certain reaction with a certain kind of person's health, and how quickly that health can be threatened and deteriorate, as we see by the evidence of so much loss that is just agonizing to read about. And we try to, on a regular basis, even those of us who may not experience it so close at hand. It seems to me that fear is a unique emotional driver, and I wonder if you'd say something about just whether you sense that is more let loose in our society right now. It's not just mistrust, which is pervasive. We talk about that a lot these days, but it's the idea to blame somebody for the fact that the systems aren't working, that they aren't fair, that they are dysfunctional, that the feedback mechanisms are broken, right? Somebody has to be blamed for that. And I'm not sure if I'm making two different points or the same point, but in many ways, it seems to me that there is a very powerful emotional driver that is generating the kind of conduct, misconduct, and kind of ugly pictures we're getting now from the ways in which people not just are responding to the pandemic, but the ways in which so many of these emotions are running rampant, particularly fear.
So I think you're absolutely right, Rabbi Hamilton. And I heard Provost Garber right before, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but I actually think you're talking about three things, right? Anti-Semitism in some ways we need to approach more as an epidemiological problem. And the fact that this is a cancer that is, or, it's a disease that's mutated over time and is impacting on a variety of societal levels. And we as a people, let alone specifically the Jewish people, haven't always been able to clearly articulate where that disease is trying to focus its energy. And we haven't always been in agreement about its mutation, particularly as it's manifested in the 21st century around anti-Zionist positions, which after the state of Israel, I would argue is an anti-Semitic position. Prior to the state of Israel is a different conversation. So there's this larger conversation about how anti-Semitism is playing out and really talking about the target, the gravity centers of where we see anti-Semitism playing out, from hard left, hard right, and radical Islamism, and being able to clearly articulate how there are different expressions of anti-Semitism, yet they exist in all of these places, and it's our responsibility not to politicize it, but rather to call it out wherever it rears its head. So that's one kind of component of the conversation. I think the second piece of the conversation that you're alluding to, which I wholeheartedly agree, and it goes not only to the trust piece that you all were talking about previously, but it also goes to the piece of, we were very much living in a world in which there were multiple communities, but these communities could interact with one another. And I don't mean just the Jewish communities, and I'm not also trying to be utopian and imagine what it was like even at different points in time in the American experience, knowing full well has always been some level of identity politics, but the level of identity politics now has been so greatly exacerbated that it allows for us to live in these very siloed positions where we don't have to interact with one another and don't have to engage. And so when you don't know who the other is, it is extremely comfortable to make generalizations, to dehumanize, to have detached sense of responsibility to a fellow human being. The third bucket I would argue that I hear you saying is that I would actually say social media is one of the largest challenges that exacerbates both the anti-Semitism piece and the breakdown of communal piece. Because what we have now is a situation in which artificial intelligence has the capability to help you figure out the way in which you should be engaging in the world, decides and curates the articles you should be engaged with, and puts you in affinity groups so that you do not have to engage with those who are different than you. And in each of the settings that I'm talking about, playing out, fear becomes a real motive to both lock down and stay in your own particular lane, and becomes a way to be able to mobilize those people to constantly be finding that scapegoat and blame, so that you don't have to self-reflect and look at how you fit into this larger ecosystem. So all of these pieces really matter. And I will say, not to knock social media completely, but we have two major challenges, and it isn't crazy that we're having this conversation based upon the president's discussion with Twitter just today and yesterday. But when you have these large social media companies not want to see themselves as media companies, and they only want to be seen as tech companies, it allows them to circumvent having to really address these problems. I believe the Wall Street Journal had an article just the other day about how their research has shown how much social media has caused divisiveness rather than creating this sense of democratization and building positive bridges. Yet they shelved that research and haven't brought it to the forefront.
Right. They treat themselves like they're public utilities. And of course, judging from the compensation that they earn and the market share and everything else, they're anything but public utilities. And I do want to go to the issue of effort, though, because I think you've laid out very, very clearly these three different areas, and then the way in which emotion sort of cuts across. One thing I want to talk to you about a little bit, and again, I know that you're not an expert in this area, nor am I, but a lot of this has to do with effort and will, and it's a lot easier, I suppose, to not only to be able to create an explanation for the cause of all the wrongs and the ills that you're facing, right? So it's due to, as long as there's going to be an explanation or an excuse or blame, then there's going to be this cancer you call correctly, this phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Any excuse will serve the hater. And we know that through history. We know that today. And I don't want to sound, and I know you don't want to sound fatalistic about it. It's not a fatalistic position, because nobody's born that way. And people can grow out of being that way. But it is nevertheless a high likelihood that people are going to choose that way, because it's frankly a lot easier to point fingers and to lay blame and to become ferociously committed to contempt and hostility toward a particular people or a particular cabal or whatever it may be, than it is to have to sit around, sort out a whole bunch of complexities, a whole bunch of converging forces, hang around people that you don't particularly like, all the things that would be remedies, right? The reason why all three of these bins are so effective is because they're relatively effortless, and they also generate and get juices flowing in us that equanimity, balance, measured judgment, self-reflection, self-criticism, weighing and measuring just don't typically afford. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic about human nature, but I am trying to acknowledge what I think you're saying, which is that it's not just that the tools are leading us there, which they are in the case of social media, which they are in the case of the ways in which people sort of collect with each other, and not with those who are make their blood boil, right? And get very emotional. And yet I want to come to first of all, I want to make space if you have a comment about that, this notion of easy versus difficult, because I want to come around to a question about how much of this we want to be the way it is, and how much of this we would really like to be different, but can't quite figure out how.
So, part of the challenge here is that those who are the haters, the detractors, I don't feel the need to put forth energy to change their heart and mind,
Right.
because I think they are wholly committed to that cause. And what I need to figure out is how I get to the folks in the middle, non-Jews and Jews that I would call the don't knows, who are not sensitized to, aware of, or educated about these forms of bigotry and prejudice and hate, and also who truly don't understand what anti-Semitism is.
Mm.
And to be honest, they don't get it because the term itself makes no sense to a younger audience. They don't even know what Semitic is referring to. And also because um, anti-Semitism, particularly in the American context, but not only, has been completely removed from understanding it in terms of other forms of hatred. So where you can solidly, no one wants to be racist, no one wants to be Islamophobic, no one wants to be homophobic, but that Jew hatred piece hasn't been on that agenda because Jews have been perceived as being part of a white majority who have power and socioeconomic mobility, and are not viewed as a vulnerable minority, and they're not viewed as a people, to be honest. They're viewed as a religious group, especially in the American context. So I need to figure out, how do I ensure that those folks in the middle are at a very young age, before they have a lot of this cognitive formation, before that prefrontal cortex is completely formed, have that sensitivity so that Jew hatred is socially unacceptable in the 21st century, the way many of us feel other forms of hatred ought to be, even though we see horrendous acts of racism occurring on a regular basis still. And we're asking ourselves, how do we more clearly define our allyship to ensure anti-racism? But I can't focus on those police officers, for example. I need to focus on everyone who's around that, so that we can slowly, longitudinally, it'll take a long time to create changes in perceptions, behaviors, attitudes, and ultimately a culture. And that's more than just a feeling. We need the affective, and we need the behavioral, and we need the cognitive.
Mm. Yeah. No, I hear you, and I think that's what brings it around. It's an excellent point. First of all, what our target is. It's not the extremists. It's not the fire-breathing folks. It's the people who are the don't knows, right? And frankly, who are going to be, in all likelihood, I'm not suggesting, and nor are you, that these people aren't sophisticated, critical, thoughtful people, um, but they're not yet indoctrinated in any particular way. There's an interesting study that Jonathan Haidt, the important psychologist or evolutionary biologist, I'm not sure what his training is actually, but he's got wonderful insights about the way that the human mind works in his Heterodoxy Institute. I heard him say this a little over a week ago in a podcast. He was talking about the ways in which people who disagree or take different views or read different, process information and assign different meaning to things. How much of that has to do with people's just comfort level and choice? That is the will to believe a certain thing. So you and I have had this experience many times where you're actually trying to present not just, as you say, cognitive information, behavioral patterning, sort of the ways in which we conduct ourselves, emotionally reinforcing, approaching it in multiple different layers, but you still come across somebody who basically waves all that aside and simply is stuck where they are on their particular belief. They don't want evidence, they don't want data, they don't want persuasion, they don't want anecdotes, they don't want to hear people get up and give testimony, they don't want any of that. They are where they are. So Jonathan Haidt and a couple other people have done some studies on this notion of a person who wants to believe something and really wants to believe what they want to believe They ask a simple question, which is, can I believe this? And if they can answer yes in one instance, then that's all they need. They are done with the evidence, done with all the facts, done with all the case in point, on and on and on. They can believe it, and so they continue to believe it. Can somebody who has hostility to Israel believe in that hostility to Israel? Can they find an example where somebody in Israel's leadership said something or did something that was morally ugly or unhandsome, right? Yes. So therefore they can. When somebody doesn't want to believe something, right? That is when they really don't want to adopt a belief. They ask the question, not can I believe this, but must I believe this? And the answer to that question is almost always no, because there's very few things that we absolutely must believe. So this explains, I think, to some extent, why will and desire and effort play such an essential role in belief formation. What are the implications of this? And by the way, I want to give a little bit of a heads up so those who want to ask questions, who are in our audience, who are listening and sharing, that you will have a chance to communicate with Robbie or go to the chat function to be able to do so in just a moment in the time we have until 11:30. What are the implications for this notion of the people who need very, very little to continue to believe what they believe and will accept virtually nothing that forces them to believe otherwise?
Look, this is an extremely difficult question, Rabbi Hamilton, and this is why we need Jonathan, to talk about this from a social psychology perspective, because it's not rational, right? If 2 + 2 = 4, we get it. And in this case, you only need one data point to be able to hold your entire worldview together, which is why it's very hard, I think, for people, especially as you get older, to actually question any worldviews you have held, because you have held them firmly as these pillars within inside your mental operating system. And that's very hard to shift. And I wonder, and I haven't had the chance to listen to this podcast fully, but I do wonder with Jonathan Haidt where critical educational learning skills comes into play here. Mm-hmm. And I ask that because if you can teach people at a very relatively young age, not to be contrarian, but to actually apply a critical thinking set of questions when they're engaging with new information, how then, if you have that skill set and you apply it and model it regularly, how you then may be able to influence people's ability around will, desire, and choices. Right. And I think the Israel, scenario that you gave is a perfect example. We see this on college campuses all the time. And I'll just say very quickly, there's sort of this litmus test for how progressive you are on campus. No one wants to go against the herd mentality to begin with, because that's the zeitgeist on campus. That's where most American Jews feel comfortable as well. That's how most American Jews vote. Yet, if you're not part of every group and don't tick it off, which includes everything around people of color, gender issues, sexuality, and then it's thrown in anti-Israel. And rarely is it truly pro-Palestinian. And so it's very hard for young people to say, but that's where I want to be, even if I disagree with this one thing. And I don't know how to talk to you all about all of this. And I will say this is where, and I heard this a little bit in the previous conversation with you, this is where complexity and nuance really matter. And we have to find a way for our society to be much more comfortable with engaging with the gray of complexity and not look for these simplistic black and white answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's, by the way, that's where stories, there are stories, as you know well, Rachel, of exceptions to this. And that, to me, I always want to blow those, I want to inflate those dramatically. The story of the Green Prince, right? The documentary that anyone can watch, I think still on Netflix, I'm not sure, where basically the story of the son of the founder of Hamas realizes early on that the movement founded by his father in the dining room had become something very, very different than the organization that had in fact his dad had been so integral in, and he ultimately becomes a very important informant for the Israeli secret intelligence department that ends up making a very, very big difference at a very critical time in the Second Intifada, when intelligence was absolutely essential, right? Another example is a book called Rising from Hatred, where one of the leaders, the up and coming white supremacist leader in America, right, who is responsible for a radio show that is listened to by just an endless number of virulent white supremacists across the country, how this person decides that he's going to go to the most progressive college in Florida and hang around the most progressive or most liberal people he can find and survive that and come out with a greater capacity to run circles around all of them in the name of continuing to advance hatred for any number of folks, including Jews and blacks and any other ethnicity, right? And what ends up happening to him as a result is that because he's a thoughtful guy, which made him so strong as the leader of the white nationalist movement, it's more nationalist than supremacist, I should correct it, he ends up being curious when he goes over to Europe and he realizes that it actually wasn't white people that did a lot of things, right, historically, that made advances. And this whole genetic superiority that he has been preaching and convinced of, he starts to question. So you get these examples of people that do find a way forward through, in spite of family, in spite of all these other factors. But there's almost something otherworldly about them because they're episodic, they're exceedingly rare. They're important to inflate because otherwise we would believe that it would be impossible. And it's not impossible, right? The fact that they are these people who recover from their extreme hatred, their leadership in hatred in some ways, is in fact very, very important. But short of that, it's extremely significant to try to address this notion of being able to hit it early on and to hit it when the before beliefs have just solidified, calcified, and to no return. And I don't know if you have anything to say about these exceptional examples, but conditions. We talked to Yossi Klein Halevi last night. It was 5 a.m. for him. It was 10 p.m. for us, and we talked a lot about, for instance, the conditions that have given rise to the fact that even though we're a long way from home in terms of being able to feel great about this, there is a lot more distance now between Israeli Arabs, that is people who are citizens of Israel and who still may support the Palestinian cause in every fiber of their being, but see themselves more and more as part of the Israeli society. And it hasn't hurt the medical establishment and the number of Israeli Arabs who are in leading positions in the medical field in Israel. But there's a lot more daylight there. There is opportunities that are surfacing geopolitically because of the hegemony of Iran and the threats that Iran represents. And you hear very few whispers around the region, especially in the part of moderate Sunni states, that they wish Israel would go away, right? And so I wonder if you would just comment on these examples, maybe outlier examples, that perhaps could give us some measure of hope.
So, as you were talking about these very, I think, rarefied examples, I thought of immediately how it's very hard for us as we get older, especially, to acknowledge our mistakes. And, we have a practice of Chuva, in which we can actually basically not only think about those mistakes and repent for them, and an attempt in many ways to transform those mistakes into opportunities for learning. And there is something unique here for us in terms of Chuva, because it is a rare person who has real strength inside them to recognize that they were mistaken in their worldview, and to basically repent and to make amends in order to change that perspective. And that is not easy to do. And those individuals have real will and desire that I think is very strong.
Right.
The other thing I would just say, Rabbi Hamilton, that I was thinking about as you were talking too, is we also have, cheshbon hanefesh, and, whether it's the accounting of the soul, in some ways, for us, we need to do more of this emotional accounting, and we also need to do more of the accounting specifically around how we consume information. And rather than just hook, line, and sinker accept it because it came from a particular news source or a friend who happens to be someone we agree with on most things, what safeguards basically can we put in place so that we can do an accounting of ideas and hold ourselves responsible as we would in other forms in our life, to say, I really need to take each piece as it comes and not just accept carte blanche.
Yeah, very, very powerful and very, very important points, Rachel. Yes, absolutely. And I think that in many ways, one of the most important final points I want to put on this is that the wholesale admitting of one's mistakes, or I'm not sure that's even necessary. I think some of it is, but one of the problems I think that people, why people white knuckle it through their views and are so reluctant to even want to go there and entertain that, is because they feel like they have to do a 180, and they don't. I mean, I take somebody like Tara Westover and her remarkable book, Educated. That's one of the things that impresses me most about her. Those who know the story of having been raised in rural Idaho, never having been in a classroom. One of the remarkable things about Tara's journey, having now got a couple PhDs and been at Oxford and everything else, is that she hasn't traded one world completely for the other. She still goes back to Idaho. There may have been mental illness, there may have been abuse, there may have been all kinds of things, but there was also love, and the love was real. And so she goes back, and her big project these days is trying to convince people, those of us who live on the coasts, that we caricature the people in rural areas, and that they return the favor. And this goes to the points you've been making tonight so well. It is the tshuva, the cheshbon hanefesh. These things don't require us to have a wholesale conversion experience where we're just doing a complete 180, regretting, apologizing, owning as somehow complete mistakes the path of our life before. They require a pivot. A pivot is not a 180, right? And if a pivot can happen, that's what I remember one of the retired generals in Israel used to say when he was talking to students on campus. He would say, my goal is to get people to ulai, to perhaps, right? Which I would define as kind of an intellectual readiness for a pivot. You're right that the prospect of having to admit mistakes and to engage at that level of a complete 180, extremely unattractive, I think, for most of us. But the prospect of being able to have that pivot, perhaps not that much. It's a turning. It's not as Chuva, as you well know, is all about, as opposed to a reversal.
But I totally agree with you. And I would say, yes, it's a pivot, but it's a pivot that requires vulnerability and self-reflection.
Yeah.
And when many of us, and it goes back to schooling and social emotional learning, have been taught that vulnerability is weakness, it's very hard for people to embrace that vulnerability that is absolutely required in order to make that pivot.
Yeah.
And we have to teach our children that they need to be vulnerable.
Right, which brings us back to the original point, which we began full circle, that vulnerability, that emotional literacy, that maybe our kids are learning a little bit better than we did. They maybe skipped a generation, right? But they're going to help us learn, and we're going to help each other learn, and that's going to become more and more necessary in the months to come, for sure. And if we can somehow begin to express that sense of taking that first step, that vulnerability, that risk, that is done with the prospect of something meaningful coming out, that actually we might actually want, whether or not it seems like we do, whether or not it seems satisfying as sharing only with the people that think like us, that get our juices going and everything else. If we can get to that place where people get a little bit tired of that and recognize there's more out there, then in fact we can look to models of people who are willing to make themselves a little bit vulnerable and find that vulnerability rewarded and have a little bit more hope of possibility. It's been a really rich conversation. I really thank you so much for staying up, for being with us, for giving of your time. I know it's valuable, and we are honored by your presence here tonight, Rachel. So I just want to say thank you for opening me up and opening us all up to consider these really hefty and important issues, in some ways that outweigh a lot of the other important things that we're thinking about, because it's where we live and how we want to be in the world, with others, with a sense of dignity, with a sense of safety, with a sense of hope.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I wish you Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach to you too, Rachel. Chag Sameach, everybody.